And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Hello and welcome to Eschaton. It's been about a month and a half since our last episode release. The delay is due to my first vacation since before COVID. We actually went to Costa Rica for 9 days, which was awesome. It felt so good to get on a plane, even to go through TSA and security. It's been a long time, but things are starting to get back to normal and open back up. I don't know if our normal will ever be what it was before all this. And, you know, we've talked about that in the podcast and will in the future, but regardless, it's nice to kind of get back to life as usual. And I hope you guys are doing the same and not letting fear or inhibitions or the media kind of restrict the way you live your lives. So anyway, I'm back in the saddle now, getting caught up with the podcast. I've actually been outlining an individual episode on a topic that I've been working on for about a month and a half, 2 months. Right before our last episode, I think I began the research on it. So without giving it away, that will be coming up soon. I didn't know what would hit first, this interview or that podcast, but just due to timing, this interview was already scheduled and on the books, and we're going to have that today, which I think you guys are really going to enjoy. This podcast is, again, I'm not going to give too much away in advance, but this one was a really fun conversation. My guest here today is John Folak. He's an author, former cargo pilot, actually just had a big life change within the last couple of months. He left his career as a cargo pilot and started on his journey to becoming an author. He writes about his own experiences, particularly with psychedelics and exploration of the mind. This is going to be different than some of the past conversations we've had on the topic of mind exploration and psychedelics, psilocybin in particular. We're going to kind of theorize and philosophize a little bit about some broader themes within the psychedelic experience. And then John's going to talk about his personal experiences as well as some of the lessons he's learned in his search for meaning and truth. So John's a really interesting guy. You'll hear that it comes across really clearly in the interview and the discussion. Very intelligent, well-written, well-read. Highly recommend his books, which I will link to in the show notes. He also has his own podcast now, which I was remiss to ask about in the show. I didn't realize that he had a podcast until we were late in the conversation, so I would have prioritized that early on, but you'll catch that at the end, and I will also link to that in the show notes, so I highly recommend you check it out. If you're new here and it's your first time listening to the podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or your podcasting platform of choice, whether that be Stitcher, Spreaker, YouTube, wherever you're finding this show. We're on Spotify, iHeartRadio. You can find us anywhere. And if there is a platform that you use that you don't see us on, please let me know via email, and I'll make sure that we do get added there. But this show is 100% organic growth, listener supported. So if you guys want to support the show, we have a link on the website, joshuawisely.com, to support us via Patreon. $1 per show would go a long way in advertising and helping this show grow. Everything that comes into this show goes back into it one way or another, either through advertising, guests, marketing material, things like that. So let me know if you have any questions or any guests you'd like to hear on the podcast. A few of you have reached out with guests you'd like me to reach out to. I have not given up on any of those. I want you to know I do read every email. I just can't guarantee that folks will get back to me. And occasionally that's the case, unfortunately. But I will continue to get guests and content on and front and center that you are interested in. So let me know if you have any recommendations. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with John Folak, the traveling nobody. And I'll be back soon with another episode. Let's get into it. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. As my listeners know, and have known for some time, psychedelics and just the spiritual journey and the exploration of plant medicines has been a pet interest of mine for the last couple of years. And I've tried to spotlight it in this podcast as much as possible. So, when somebody like yourself with a background of, writing on the subject and then experimental, studies with yourself on the subject, that piques my interest. So I'm excited to have the chance to talk to you. And I guess starting right from the top, the name, The Traveling Nobody, and we'll get into your story in a little bit. But if you just want to start from the top, how did you get into this space, and how did you get that moniker for yourself, and what's your journey?
Sure. I'll just start with what it was that brought me directly to the psychedelics and started that journey off, which for me in the beginning was the mushroom. And what brought me there was heartbreak. It was pain and suffering, which is not uncommon, I think, for many of us who begin our journeys of healing and use the psychedelics as tools to help us out in that journey. So what it really was is I went through a heartbreak, in short, and I was devastated. I was ruined, and it was a natural consequence of the models and the world's views that I was bringing to the table. So they were going to implode or explode or whatever, but it happened. And that took me a while to recover from. So physically, I was in terrible shape. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, just all of the hallmark signs of a true heartbreak. And I suppose after that, I began to investigate natural cures for the diluted form of that heartbreak that was just continuing out and extending into my life, which was a mild form of depression, I would say, for sure. And just the mainstream psychiatric route was not going to be an option for me. That just never seemed like it was going to be in my path. So I think I straight up just started Googling cures for depression, and I ran into psilocybin, the active drug in the mushroom. So I began to look into the studies that were centered around it being helpful for those with PTSD and just helpful for those in terminal situations too, with giving life a sort of better look when they previously had a condition that was going to take them out of the game unexpectedly. So that was rattling around in my head, and I said, wow, those are pretty extreme circumstances. If it could be helpful there, certainly it should be helpful for a heartbreak. And it took me about a year and a half, but then I finally used the mushroom myself. And that was sort of a journey too, but in short, I ended up growing it myself. I just had to. I couldn't really trust anyone.
Wow, your first time you grew it yourself?
I did, and that's why it took me so long. It took me about a year and a half. Part of that, without getting off topic too much, was just that I resisted the call to that adventure. I think that's part of the journey. We know we might want to try something out, but for various reasons, we're resistant to it. And I was definitely in that position for a while. But eventually, I got to it. I grew my own successfully. It was a meager amount at first, but it was enough to experiment with. And I did. I launched into experimentation, and I was looking by then to break through. I wanted to have the mystical experience. I suppose I was initially driven by curiosity, or excuse me, by healing, but then it definitely turned into curiosity, and I wanted to see what would be delivered. And it certainly delivered. It turned into part of my practice. I began to use it in a once a month, more formalized setting and set for myself, which was just simply alone and eliminating sensory input so that I could experience what it was that the medicine had to offer me. And this eventually really catapulted me into the journey. And we could get into that, but right back to the pen name. So after exploring it for a while, I just saw the benefits, the healing benefits for me personally. And the mushroom eventually gave me a lesson, a teaching, which was the ground level of everything, the foundational structure of reality itself. And it depicted the figure eight, so the classical infinity symbol. Mm-hmm. And this was essentially the mushroom telling me that they had knowledge, if you'll accept that kind of way of describing it. They had knowledge of what the ground floor of infinite intelligence was, and it was just showing me it's a cycle, not dissimilar from the Ouroboros or any of the infinity symbols. And that was visually depicted to me behind closed eyes, but the feeling associated with it was that we truly are the imagination of ourselves, and we're here, at the very least, for experience, to kind of remember more of the self through our life cycles, this, that, and the other. I didn't know what to do with that at the time, so that led me into seeking to explore other plant teachers. And almost immediately after I had gotten that teaching, I decided that I would have to consult Mother Ayahuasca. So I looked up a center in Costa Rica. I found a promotional video that they had with a song that they played, which just really, to the core, resonated with me, and I knew I had to book it. So that was it. I booked that. And after going to Mother Ayahuasca and experiencing a couple ceremonies there in the rainforest of Costa Rica, which was just absolutely beautiful, and the group communal setting was wonderful as well, I came away with essentially the same teaching validated, but it was much more imbued with absolute overflowing love. to put a general term on it. That's really what it was. So I guess in a metaphoric way, when you're given something like that, many of us come back and we feel as though we're an open energetic circuit now, like from toes to head, and we have to allow that to flow. We have to do something with that energy. So by this point, it had been years of me exploring mostly the mushroom on my own and then ayahuasca, and I decided this has to come out in a formalized way. And interestingly enough, there was actually a man at the ceremony who recommended Joseph Campbell to me, which became foundational to my writing. That was essentially the mythologist who devoted most of his studies to figuring out the heroic cycle, which is a series of stitched together patterns of human behavior that essentially constitute a good story. And that was what his formulated evidence was, the hero cycle that came from his study. So anyway, I began to formulate essentially my story as an everyman character with that template. And if I was to come from that angle, I thought, what better name than no one? It's everyone. It's a perspective from the everyman angle, which essentially could be anyone. Now, it does follow my character's story in this world, but the forces that were dealt with, heartbreak and bankruptcy and chaos and order and all of this, they're forces that we all deal with in our life cycles.
Interesting. So I actually just got back from Costa Rica last week. I wasn't there for that purpose, but I did meet a guy while I was down there who had so I met him in central Costa Rica near Arenal volcano, but he was actually coming from Nosara, a beach town, and he had done a 10-day ayahuasca ceremony there. And you could tell like this guy, like, yeah, he was a veteran. Like he'd done this many times. But you used the term mother ayahuasca. I've only had one ayahuasca experience. And I was telling you before we jumped in here that, I kind of came to plant medicines later in life. I didn't experiment with any of them at all as a teenager in my early 20s. It was my late 20s when I came to it from a very eager perspective to learn and really just kind of self-explore. It wasn't from, like a party perspective with MDMA or anything like that. It was kind of a discipline or a spiritual discipline. And anyway, in that first experience that I had with ayahuasca, I had what some have since told me is a classic ayahuasca experience with a very serpentine type entity that I met. And it was very feminine, but, and we can get into this a little bit later, because I read in some of your work that there was kind of a sensuality to some of your experiences, particularly with psilocybin, which I had as well. And I want to talk about because I have friends who say like that shouldn't happen with mushrooms, or it hasn't for them, but it did for me. So I was relating to you on that level. But with ayahuasca, there was like a sensuality, but not in like this weird carnal. Yes, but no, not just like a weird carnal, like lust. It was more, it was like a primal energy. Like I was tapping into like the feminine energy of the earth. And I know that sounds super like new age, but it's the only words I really have to describe it. But it was like a primal creation force, I guess is what I would say is what it felt like. But it was just like this sensual feeling. And I met this serpent type creature. And afterwards was when I did the reading in the literature where people started using this term mother ayahuasca. So kind of taking a little bit of a left-hand turn here. We'll get back on track with the narrative, but I wanted to ask you, when you experienced ayahuasca, did you have any sort of that context in terms of quote unquote standard experiences or the mother ayahuasca type entity or archetype?
Surprisingly, not so much, at least not the very first ceremony there when I was in Costa Rica. There were actually two ceremonies over 2 consecutive days. And the first one was very formless, very much just that I was floored with the energy of this plant teacher, or of the self, or of what it is that these tools allow us to access, just that energetic essence that does exist, that seems to animate the physical and non-physical worlds, the transcendent, basically. And it seemed to lack the character that you were describing, at least on that first experience. But as I said, I was definitely filled with this universal love that was undeniable. And I suppose there could have been a feminine quality to that in description. Certainly I've run into that with a mushroom, and we could maybe bookmark that and get back to that later. But anyway, with Mother Aya, not a ton of the typical ways that it is described, at least with my first experience, but it definitely gave me, I think, what I needed. And then subsequently in the next experience, which was the next night, I was given more of the, I suppose, the traditional themes that you could come to expect with ayahuasca experiences, such as just being very organic, very tied to the earth. It does seem like with experience and use, the mushroom seems to have a very science fiction vibe to it.
Mm,
It seems to want to show you things that are not of this world
yeah.
in some ways, if that'll kind of suffice for a description. But Mother Ayahuasca traditionally has been referred to as not of that nature, of being more organic and rooted to the planet. And anyway, on that second experience, I was definitely given more of, I think, the flavor of the planet or the biosphere as being a living sort of entity. It was just filled with life, almost from insects to just almost the spirit of life itself. And it seemingly animated much more with that than what the mushroom had ever previously given me.
Yeah. Okay. So I vibe with a lot of that because with mushrooms in particular, I've gotten multiple times this sense of like entities outside of myself with kind of like, hey, come here, look at this, and like showing you different things and like creating forms out of thought and like watching things deconstruct and reconstruct. Terrence McKenna had a term for he calls them the machine elves. And I definitely in my last, this is about a year ago now, but my most recent psilocybin experience, which I'll tell you more about later, it wasn't pleasant. I encountered these creatures, these gremlin type creatures that you would call the machine elves, but it felt like there were clearly a consciousness outside of my own being. So I'm wondering, like, did you experience whether it be your first time with Aya or with psilocybin, like an awareness of a consciousness or presence outside of yourself, or did you feel like you were tapping into like your own inner psyche?
Uh, hmm, that's a good question. Really, I think with continued exploration, and I'm not trying to dodge your question, but you kind of get to see that they're the same
Mm.
thing. And I'm really not trying to be
No,
dodgy,
no, no.
but
Somebody else has said that before too. So yeah, I'm interesting. But yes, I kind of thought you might say something to that effect.
yeah, yeah. So just in short with that too, I will say that when I went to Mother Ayahuasca, I had explored the mushroom many times. So I had broken open the psychedelic doors and I had some footing in that space. If that will kind of work for a description, of course, because you never have complete control over these things, but you have some competence in your navigational strategy. So I kind of had that going for me, and I had worked with that space before. And it seemed like the more I did it, I was investigating the nature of self. And you might just think about that in a basic way as well. Yourself, your psyche, kind of to the point of your question, you're diving in. But then when you keep doing that, you almost seem to get a visual associated with it sometimes, quite literally, which is that you're going in and then that torus is kind of coming back around to create the world without. And the living world is perhaps a representation of your inner world. Certainly the line between worlds seems to dissolve in some of these spaces with continued exploration. And then it becomes clear that you're just kind of like exploring that transcendent self, that capital S self. And that teaching, I think, is delivered in different ways depending on where you are in your journey. But it seems to be, from talking to others in the space and exploring myself, what you kind of get to. And so when I went to ayahuasca and I was describing that sort of first night, which was not traditionally the attributes that would be associated with ayahuasca, it was giving me a very intense version of the self, but so filled with love. It was almost like the most grand mirror you could possibly imagine looking into, as if it were a guru or a spiritual teacher that was reflecting the nature of the capital S self to me. So something along those lines.
Okay. So you talk about getting back to the narrative of this a little bit to kind of give people a context of, who you are, where you come from. You're a cargo pilot, I believe, right? And, that's your professional background that you came from. But ultimately, you were set down this path to actually want to, pursue psychedelics or plant medicines full time in terms of writing about them, sharing the story, and perhaps sharing, what you believe to be deep rooted truths that you've discovered from your experiences. So, I mean, that's a pretty profound life change. So what got you from A to B in that regard? Like what was the big moment that really set you down this path?
It was just recently. It was the last major trip I had with the mushroom, and I'll describe that. But yeah, just to clarify, in that I was up until just very recently a cargo pilot, up until mid-February of this year,
Oh,
and then
wow. Very recent.
yeah, very recent. And it was kind of coming to a head with my job, the way that it was demanding things of me that weren't acceptable, and the way that my journey was laying itself out with all of this and what I knew I had to do. So it came to an end that was seemingly unavoidable. But anyway, so yeah, this is now fully my deal, and I'm in the unknown working it out, which is, of course, part of the journey. But how did I get there? I would say specifically, it was the last trip I took. And like I told you, about 8 years ago is when I went through that heartbreak, and that began my waking up cycle. So I had been exploring the psychedelics in this way, meaning that I would take them in generally higher doses for the most part, and then attempt to really get something out of that and put it to work for myself in the world so that I could develop. And that was always the idea, it could grow. So used in that way, I paired them up with the heroic cycle. And then, of course, always attempted to live it out. Well, the last version of that for myself was that I was very busy at work, and I knew I couldn't sustain this. This was at the end of last year, November. So I booked 4 days and nights out in the desert of Western Texas here, and I took a formal week off work to have a vision quest out there. Now, I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I knew that I was going to be in solitude, and I was going to come prepared to use the mushroom if that called to me while I was out there. But I wasn't even sure if I was going to use it, because I was truly in the unknown. I mean, there was just so much anxiousness. I had never done anything like that with myself. I never really even driven off road. So to take 4 days and nights out in the desert, it was a big commitment, but I did it. And what I was given out there was a whole series of events, but the last day it led me up to the notion that I should take more mushrooms than I ever had at any previous point in my life if I'm looking to figure something out and do something with the experience so that I could further my character's path in this world. In short, what I was given was that human will is a sort of energetic signature that you could place upon the gridwork of reality, which has very real, almost gravitational effects to it, which draw the natural consequences to you. Now, that sounds a little metaphoric and abstract. The way that this took form for me was that I was in the desert in the middle of the day. It was very hot. I was sitting in my tent in meditation. Every so often, a breeze came through, and I began to think that I could have some command over that breeze. So I attempted this, and through trial and error, I convinced myself that to the degree I was able to will the breeze to come to me, it sort of seemed to. It did. And then I realized that thinking in language or even attempting to blanket the whole thing with a concept was muddling the process. And what became more efficient, seemingly, was just a pure, focused will. And as I said, like you're imprinting that upon the grid work there of reality, and then the results come to you. Now, that seemed to kind of be happening. Of course, as you know, in these states, your consciousness is very uprooted from where it normally is. So it very well could have been I was just subconsciously picking up on cues that a breeze was going to come in, and then thinking I'm commanding it around. But anyway, the bigger picture point that I don't think we could get away from is that that process is sort of always happening with your life and the decisions you're making. You're always placing an energetic signature upon the grid work of your reality, which inevitably draws the consequences of that signature to you. And I just knew when I was coming out of this whole experience that I could no longer delude myself about what my life path seemed to be. I'm 33 years old. I'm very convinced that there is a highest and best use for each one of us, as we are the heroes of our own lives, and we can find that. That's like the treasure that we all have. That's our particular thumbprint. If we find that, the task is to bring that home, to integrate it, and to bring that value to the world. This is my whole spiel. And I wasn't exactly living it out because I was still working a job that wasn't consistent with what I knew I should be doing. So interestingly, I came back the next day from that experience, and I had a call scheduled with a marketing company for my books I was working with. Great company. Launched my book. Great people. And on this three-way phone call, I reported what I just told you of that story. And someone on the other end of the call said, okay, great. Well, we'll run with your full name on all the books, and we'll have at it. We're going to cast it out there. I said, I don't know about that. That's not going to be a great career move. And the person I was talking to simply said, what did you just tell me? You just reported that you found what you believe to be your highest and best use, and your work is to bring it home, integrate it, and go forth with your full name on your work, claim what you have put out there. I said, yeah, yeah, that's what I just said. I didn't have it fully integrated myself. So that was really the last major event in my life that told me I had to do it, and now I'm in that space working it out.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you hope to accomplish in terms of, all of the literature you've been creating, at a feverish pace? You want to get a message out to the world, obviously, but at the same time, like, what's the, I don't know if there's an end goal per se, but I mean, what's the the end all be all from the perspective of what you hope the books will achieve?
Connection. That was always the point. It was connection. I wrote a book before this Visionary Quest series, and just these are very short, hopefully entertaining trip reports. That's basically what they are. The first book I wrote, Psychedelic Hero's Journey of a Traveling Nobody, I was talking about after that Ayahuasca experience. That was working my process out in many ways, and it was just very long. It was a lot, and I sculpted it and created the best piece of art that I could at that point in my life. But the critique I got from people who cared for me and loved me kind of said, it's not going to connect. It's just too much. And they have a very good point. So that inspired the new series, which was to connect. So in short, the idea is to connect. I mean, quite literally through doing this, through having conversations with people as cosmic travelers, comparing notes and finding something more out about the nature of reality. Now, hopefully, I would like the books, obviously, to entertain too, and to connect so that I could ride that and it be financially self-sustainable. I don't know if that's possible. I really don't, but I'm in the process of working it out. But I think a bigger part of the whole thing too is that I actually seek to sort of work this stuff out with my life, and the reports are just a testament to that. So what I seem to have found is basically what I just told you. We all have that highest and best use, that is a treasure, requesting after it. In order to get your call to it, you proceed through life. You get it, you find it, you hopefully kind of know what it is or something close to it. And now it seems to me like it is the obligation of the individual to begin to do the work to integrate that and bring value forth to the collective so that you could really put your legit, authentic thumbprint upon the blueprint of reality or something like that. So right now, I'm very curious and excited and feel the responsibility to actually live that out. So if that kind of answers what is the goal, it's to see if I can make it happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I've had kind of a mixed response over the years to psychedelics, about psychedelics from peer group and social circles, acquaintances, etc. A lot of that's pushed by the media. A lot of that's just personal choice and whatnot. And for me, I stayed away from it for a lot of years because I kind of viewed a lot of psychedelics in a recreational sense. And it wasn't until I was older that I learned about the spiritual component. But I bring that up because even now, and it's become a lot more kosher in our culture to kind of talk about these things and explore these things, because we're starting to dabble more into the spirituality of it and understand that there's actually verified and bona fide health benefits, specifically around, PTSD, for example. I've had vets on this podcast talking about how psychedelics have helped them really with suicidal thoughts and depression. So, and that's just scratching the surface of what these plant medicines can do, but still, I hear a lot of feedback from people, even in this audience, sometimes a mixed bag of some people saying that they associate it with, other hard drugs. They'll mention psilocybin in the same sentence as something like crack cocaine or heroin. And it's just, it's obviously, an ignorance on some level, but you don't want to speak down to people about that. You want to educate them so that they'll be more receptive to it. So, I heard a quote from Sam Harris, a philosopher, who once said that, I feel like if you don't have at least one psychedelic experience in your lifetime, that you've really missed out on one of the great core components of the human experience. And at the time, I hadn't had one, and I was like, really? So when I did, I understood right away what he meant, because it's like being a pioneer or an explorer, but within the depths of your own being. And I saw parts of myself that I couldn't possibly have seen in a normal, sober state of mind. And now that I've had that, you want other people to have it as well, right? But some people are averse to it. So my question is, how do you respond, or what would your answer be to people who are either, hesitant or fearful to experiment or explore the world of psychedelics because of maybe a religious stigma or a personal fear? Any of the above. Like, how do you respond to that?
That's a good point, because I think many of us on the journey run into that, especially when we have a really beneficial and growth catalyzing experience. We just want to shout from the rooftops and tell everyone to go have that same experience. And that's kind of what you're talking about there with Sam Harris. I mean, yeah, of course, there's a lot of value to that. And I had any number of those examples in my life too before I was drawn to experiment myself. So there's obviously a point to people talking about it, and then others hearing the call through them and investigating themselves. I guess, though, what I have learned over time is not to shout from the rooftops as much, which seems really odd because I'm writing about this and really touting the benefits, at least for myself, as this everyman sort of character, which I'm putting forth as kind of all of us. I'm not so sure, though, that the psychedelic experience is for everyone in this lifetime. I think it is a personal call to adventure. And I think more than anything else, too, that's what a lot of my description has become of the territory. It has been that we have this archetypal sort of process underneath seemingly the surface of our lives. And it involves these core elements, that call, that intuition, do this, go here, that type of thing. And we listen and we immerse in the unknown. And now we have the ability to inform ourselves with the new information and bring that home and all of this. Now, all of that happens in a very encapsulated way within a psychedelic journey. So it's a really good iteration, I think, of that cycle, and it begins to allow you to abstract some of those elements out if you're consciously attempting to do so, certainly, and then apply that to life. And in many ways, that's sort of been my cycle. But again, back to the point, I'm not so sure that it is in everyone's life path. And I will say personally on that, I've tripped with my father before, and he tripped with me with the mushroom because I brought it to him, of course. And he loves and trusts me, and I him, and we have a very good relationship. The first time around, just to give you a real experience of why I changed my tune and all of this, was a light dose. It was very appreciative. It's what I often liken to the Zen appreciation dose, which is about a dried gram of the mushroom. You just appreciate everything, and things can be great, yeah, especially in a safe setting and all of that, which we were in. But then the second time around we did it, I explained to him that if you're looking to learn something about yourself, you just up the dose. And my recommendation usually on that is, if a person wants to do that, to about double it every time. So we went into about 2 grams, 2.5, 2 grams. And he did not have the same experience. It wasn't terrible, but I could tell he wasn't really going to let go, to completely absorb what the thing could offer him. And it turned out fine. We ended up actually talking each other down and having a real bonding experience, which we shared very legit and pure emotions with each other through conversation. That was great. But afterward, I said to myself, my dad wasn't exploring it for the same reasons that I were, which was that I felt a personal call to do so. And because of that, I think it was just never going to be something that he was going to find use out of. And I think a lot of people can be in that category. That being said, I think there is a certain time in anyone or everyone's life potentially where they might consider such a thing. And if that's the case, I would say that's enough of a curiosity that I would call that the call to adventure. And if they begin exploring and have any other number of things in life line up that kind of leads them to that, then of course it's a personal decision. Free will reigns, and go for it. You've taken your call to adventure. But again, not sure that is real with the psychedelics for everyone in their life.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good answer. I like how you tie like the Campbell kind of hero's journey into the psychedelic experience. It kind of has like a Carl Jung flavor to it as well, in terms of like self-discovery and like exploring the psyche and, writing your own narrative. And I really do believe we are the authors of our own ship. So from that perspective, that alone, I think this is the frontier that kind of beckons to a lot of us. I'll say this, and again, not to make this about myself or talk about my own experiences, but I'll give you one example just because I think this would be relatable maybe for you, but for others as well. And I'm curious what your thoughts would be on this. So I've had 2 what you would call heroic doses of psilocybin in my life. The first one was 2.5 years ago, maybe. It was shortly after my first ayahuasca experience. And it was very pleasant. I mean, the way I would describe it is about 20 minutes in, I felt a frequency change in my head. I heard it. I saw like green grid lines and they disappeared. It was like a matrix, like in the Matrix almost. And then after that, it was like I was out of my body, out of this realm, just like exploring the universe. And it was a very hypnotic, but almost like transcendental experience of witnessing creation, witnessing the power of mind and will, and understanding the eternal nature of our spirits, our souls, whatever you want to call them. Like that was when that really hit me, and my fear of death just went away. The second one, however, was almost the polar opposite of that. And this was about a year ago. And long story short, this was last August. I was in a really dark place, probably either first or second worst, pits I had been in my life. I was going through a lot of personal stuff and self-exploration and not liking what I was seeing, dealing with some family issues. And for whatever reason, I decided in that state of mind to do a heroic dose of psilocybin. And the experience kind of, I was hoping it would counteract what I was experiencing and show me something. But instead, what it did was it just heightened what I was already in. And it took me into this netherworld, like outside of the realm of this reality, but it was very negative. I saw what you would call these machine elves, gremlin type creatures. I watched them deconstruct my brain, and it felt like I was going insane. If I could compare it to anything, it felt like I died 100 deaths during that few hours, and I was literally going to need to be institutionalized. Like I didn't think I was going to come back, and it was very dark. But at the end, it was very hopeful. I remember meeting this creature. He came to me in the form of a wolf and in the form of an owl, and I think it felt like it was God or some sort of superior consciousness, but coming to me in an animal form. And it kind of gave me peace and contentment at the end. But after I had gone through these cycles of just constant torture and death, and it was kind of just showing me that everything's going to be okay. Ultimately, you know, it was very somber, but positive. The reason I tell you all that is because it kind of left me with a PTSD. And I was telling you that I talk to these people who say they've used psilocybin and it's kind of like been a treatment to them for PTSD. Yeah, I've net positive, and I don't want to scare anybody away from it. It's been very net positive for me. But this one experience, when I was already in a dark place of mind, it left me in a really, you know, vulnerable, kind of frightened state when I came out of it, to the point where I kind of had PTSD, where if I would hear like Native American music or just like ambient music for a while, it would freak me out because it reminded me of that one particular bad trip. And if I'm being completely honest, I haven't had the gumption or the nerve to like really try another journey since then, because I was so frightened by that one. I know I will at some point, but I haven't been rushing back into it. And it was like, it's like having a pet that is like, you know, you think you know it really well, and you've got it down, and you pet it, and one day he just bites you. And that's kind of what it felt like out of the blue. Like I got bit by something that I felt like I was getting a grasp of. And it was almost like it taught me, like, you don't control this. You're not in control here. Like it was showing me things within me, but I had no hand on the wheel. So I'm wondering, one, have you ever had what would be called a bad trip? And then two, what do you make of that? Is this just something we create in our own psyche, and then the plant medicine enhances it? Or is this teaching us or showing us something else entirely?
Mm-hmm. I've certainly had my share of bad experiences, bad trips, you might say. But I think we'll kind of clarify that. I'm not sure that any of them are, if you attempt to get something out of it and put it into your process so that you don't have to repeat a version of that for yourself. And I'll just say, man, I appreciate you sharing that way. I am too. I'm scared every one of these things that I go into. I think most of us who go into this space conscientiously and do so over and over again, in some way know, well, potentially what could be on the horizon, and that's enough to scare you to the core, or it should be after some of these experiences. So yeah, that's just as transparent as it gets, and I am of that same state most times going into it. So I have definitely had the bad trip. I've only had 2 ayahuasca events, I would say. The first one I described to you when I went to Costa Rica, there were 2 ceremonies there, but I'm kind of grouping that as one event. And then a couple years later, I went to another ceremony, which was just within the States. It was a traveling group within the United States, and they happened to be close to where I was living at that time. And actually, a jungle friend from the first ayahuasca ceremony, he dialed me up on Facebook, and we were all in a group together, and he said, hey, I kind of remember you live in this state, and there's this reputable group, they're going to be around you. And that was really like Mother Ayahuasca dialing me up through the connections of life, because I had never even really communicated with this friend outside of that first ceremony. So I went. I decided that's what I had to do. It was right after I finished writing my first book, and I felt in many ways like that was the task from Mother Ayahuasca the first time, or just the plant medicines the first time, and after that, I was at a loss for what to do. So it was kind of adrift, and then I got that call. So anyway, I went to the second event, ayahuasca event, and it was just a night. It was in a lodge that was rented in the backwoods of Kansas, or plains of Kansas. And I got there, and it was really cool. I mean, everyone was very kind and open. So the vibe was very pleasant, I would say, and peaceful. But I took the medicine, and somehow I want to say I just knew it wasn't going to be all love and light and bliss and the most positive elements of eternity, the way you were describing with your first heroic dose. And I would certainly say, just as a side note on that, my first, however many heroic doses were very much the way you described yours. There's a parallel there. It's almost like maybe sometimes the psychedelics give you some of the better elements before they take the gloves off and really show you something. So I think that's a tried and true concept, applies to many of us as well, and certainly both of us. So anyhow, so it put me in a kind of psychedelic hell. And I had never been to a place like that before. I didn't even know places like that existed. So kind of going to your question, is that just inside you, or is it a group environment, or is it a kind of energy that might be present, or something like that, or all of the above in some weird way? So kind of parse it out without being too lengthy about it. What happened was I found myself in sort of the river Styx, or like that river of animated corpses you see in all these movies, kind of pulling you down, which was just terrifying in and of itself. And then I suppose that part of it was transcended, not through anything I did. It just kind of ended there. And I found myself at the green and white spiral carnival wall. And I think this is the chrysanthemum that McKenna would have spoken of, Terrence McKenna, the boundary layer between whatever space you're in and then that next ratcheted up space you could get into where perhaps you meet the Machine Elves. And I didn't know what to do. I was absolutely terrified. So the only thing I could rest on was what I thought were the higher order eternal truths, such as love. So I was throwing these things at the spiral carnival wall, and love, that must be real, right? Nothing. Just void. I was just looking at the carnival wall, which seemed to represent absolute void. Didn't care what I said. Truth. That's the constant of reality. It's a constant in the dynamic flux. No. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I was lost at sea looking for anything to cling to keep afloat, and I just got stonewalled. Eventually, it was most likely the chemical just dissipating and me not knowing what to do. I tried to just empty and sit with it, but that was equally as terrible and can be likened to what you were talking about, dying, all those deaths. It was just pain and suffering and in the presence of void, of complete lack of any kind of meaning or hope whatsoever. So that's why I describe it as a psychedelic hell. And it just gave way. And my interpretation afterward was something along the lines of, there was a question mark after every one of those higher order principles that I threw at it. Love? Truth, right? That isn't going to give you the tool that you need. If you don't know how to use these things and you don't have the confidence in them, you're not going to be able to make it work for yourself. And I think this could be applied to the life cycle too. I think there are these abstractions, these higher order principles we could use in a tool-like fashion. But if we're not confident in the usage of that tool, it's just simply not going to work. And again, going back to the idea that they really do reflect the self to you, I think that's what the teaching was. It was showing me in many ways that my life at that point was a diluted form of this psychedelic hell, which lacked confidence. That was part of my problem. And quite literally, I was working a job that was extremely unfulfilling, and I lacked the initiative to make a change in my life. Well, it wasn't too terribly long after this that I decided I had to confront some elements of myself that I was lacking confidence in. And for better or worse, I had to press into that because I could not allow my life to be a form of that hell. And so that was kind of the teaching present. And I know I drifted away from the question a little bit, but to kind of tie it all back together, is it just an element of my psyche? Well, yeah, it was in that case, for sure. It was an element of some things I had to work through that I was otherwise unaware of that even really existed. Was it a sort of group collective experience? Interestingly enough, I woke up the next morning and I heard someone next to me describing a demonic possession through his experience. He felt something similar. He was describing a similar hellish state. And of course, ayahuasca has been known to induce group hallucinations. Or was it perhaps just like an energy, present in the room for whatever reason that was independent of any one of us? Yeah, maybe. Could very well have been. But again, when you kind of talk about that capital S self and how these things begin to show it to you, I think all of the above or might have been the case in some sense, but it gave at least me exactly what I needed to proceed out of that. And that's the weird interconnected nature of life that these things really show you.
What do you think, though? Obviously, we know what the origin is from a chemical compound perspective of the psychedelic or hallucinogenic experience, but it just seems too convenient for we live in a modern materialist world where everything is just, we look for the materialist answer and don't really go far beyond that. And not to get into like a religious or an origins kind of question here, not because that wouldn't be interesting, but because that's not really what I'm asking or really interested in. My question is, what's the genesis of the psychedelic experience in terms of its relationship with mankind? Because you have to imagine that like our ancient ancestors from, caveman days and, paintings that they found in, ancient Gaul or France, those people, have been found in areas that are known to have hallucinogenic substances, mushrooms, etc. So it doesn't take hard. It doesn't take much effort to understand that they probably were having psychedelic experiences, which would have fed into a lot of the spiritual or divination type practices of the time, whether it be, the Greeks worshiping, gods at festivals like Bacchanalia and Saturnalias and things like that, or the Druids and the Celtic culture. Like a lot of that, I always just assumed was like the origin of that was either like some divine creation story that kind of transmutated around the world, but was all derived from the same thing. The older I get and the more experience I have, the more I think that a lot of cultures around the world are probably just tapping into a lot of the same psychedelic experiences. And that's probably why there's a lot of similar fingerprints with a lot of these practices and rituals. Why though? Like what would cause, what's the purpose? Like, we know there's a benefit for like PTSD or maybe even like psychological trauma, but beyond that, have you found in your own experience or experimentations, is there anything more in terms of what you think the plants are trying to teach us or hope that we take away from, the consumption of them?
I do. In a very concise way, I think it is to show us the self, the absolute transcendent self, the infinite that exists. And the way that I think about these compounds is that they are sort of error codes within the matrix of life. So you can know it. And if you think about consciousness as being that absolute ground floor self, which is devoid from experience, it always goes to my mind to think about the old Jewish riddle, which says, what does God, a being or an entity that is all knowing, all present, and all powerful, lack? Limitation. It lacks limitation. So part of the structure of reality is limitation. I am separate, seemingly, through the ego from yourself, from the rock, the chair, all of these things. But if they're all from the same thing through these individuated consciousnesses, we have the ability to experience ourselves. We've, in an Alan Watts way, we've bought the ticket and forgotten about it, and now we're here to play our roles.
Yeah.
And then some of us through the journey, we begin to question that and say, I'm not so sure about all of this. We're bound within the illusion, and we investigate whatever it is. You and I, with psychedelics, and many of us have used those. There are, of course, all kinds of different spiritual disciplines, but I will say the psychedelics really deliver, especially with a heavy dose. They're going to show you. And it seems like through continued exploration of them, if there is any theme that many of us seem to find, certainly myself, it is that grand self, that you are it. It almost seems as though you are entering into a remembrance of it. And then you start coming back, and you might think about this as shades of gray between that absolute clear white light and perhaps absolute void. Maybe that's like the other end of that duality or something. And between there is the different layers of self that you might experience in some of the psychedelic spaces, darker or lighter. You know what I mean? And we're, with our personalities and our egos, are just here in the world, I think, to understand something more about the self in a very Jungian way, as you referred to earlier. And I think about that self too in the way that I was telling you about shades of gray, like it is giving you the call to adventure within your life. And just metaphorically, you might think about that as the higher self, which is like a slightly lower representation of the absolute transcendent self. But that is the thing that calls you forth to know more of yourself. If you're in a video game or something and you're in a role-playing game, you might think about stacking your character up and jacking all his attributes up, right? And that might be something you do if you had a cheat code in the game. Well, I think life is something like that, and we can do that. The way it takes form, though, is in time and through trial and error process of development through the cycle. And the more we proceed along that jacking our stats up, we proceed along the life cycle. We learn and grow and understand more of the self. If there is an end point, which I'm not so sure there exactly is, that's the nature of the infinite. This is where language fails us. But if there is an absolute, that is the grand total all or something. And it just seems like these error codes are strewn about the video game. We've given them for ourselves to remember.
Yeah. You said a word there that kind of hits differently for me since I started experimenting with psychedelics, and that was remembrance. So especially with mushrooms, but I think just in general, but especially with mushrooms, I kind of got this theory that I can't take really full credit for it, and it maybe is complete bunk. I don't know. Maybe it'll be bullshit, but I've been thinking about this for a couple of years now, and it's premised on an experience I had first time I did mushrooms. So I saw my wife, who I was with at the time, I did it. I watched her turn into a Native American woman right in front of me, like headdress and all. And these mushrooms, this particular batch, came from the Pacific Northwest. So this would have been like Nez Perce or Lakota Indian or Native American territory. And I got to thinking, because I've had very native experiences with mushrooms for the most part. Another time I did mushrooms, I felt like I could hear a waterfall, and it felt like on the other side of that waterfall, I could hear Native American chanting, almost like a rain dance type of vibe, but it was distant. It sounded like it was behind water. I had another guy on the podcast a year or two ago. This guy's a scholar who studies ancient cultures, and he said that water is a metaphor or a symbol to represent kind of a border between realms or between different planes of reality, which kind of freaked me out because this was right after I had that experience. But anyway, I had this experience that was very native, and I don't know why. I don't have Native American blood, don't come from a Native American tradition, but it was native, and I found these mushrooms, were consumed and used by the natives in the area where they originated. So I started thinking about plant memory. Humans have memory. Some people are even suggesting now through DNA study that memory can be imprinted on your DNA, and you can not have a clear memory, but you can have imprints or fades or shades of a memory from your ancestors, which is why you might have certain phobias or certain anxieties around things that you have no reason to be anxious about. If that's the case, do you think it's also possible that potentially plants could have memory, and when we consume the mushroom or consume a psychedelic from a certain part of the world, that maybe we're seeing reality from the perspective of the thing that we're consuming for a short time, whether it be the mushroom or the ayahuasca? Have you ever thought about that possibly?
Yeah, and especially going to the point we were talking about earlier when these different plant teachers seem to have very different characters. Just for example, the mushroom being more space-like seemingly versus Aya, which seems to have everything to do with the planet and such. So yeah, that question definitely comes to light. It seems certainly possible when you consider that. I think though too, if we just think about life, the tree of life, of course we are a branch of it, and then the plants are a branch of it, and so too is the mushroom, obviously. So they all have their own sort of evolutionary hero's journeys within that particular species. And going along with that, I would say they might have their own collective unconscious as well. So you're tapping into the mushroom. And I think there's a part of it that goes to the absolute with what I was talking about before, with higher doses and all of that. And especially with a conscious attempt to explore that, it'll show you, seemingly. But it might very well be, too, that you can question it in a way which is that it is an independent entity with its own unconscious memory complex or collective unconscious memory complex or something like that. And you're tapping into it from engaging, communing with it. So specifically with the mushroom, I have previously convinced myself that that's what was happening. And in fact, when I was telling you that they were giving me representation earlier in my journey of the infinite, of absolute intelligence consuming its own tail, like the Ouroboros type thing, that they were not that. That was the message they gave me. The mushrooms essentially said, to put it in the description that we could use here, look, we know more than you. We are a branch of the evolutionary tree of life, not dissimilar from humans in that way. But if you want to see the grand nature of all, we will show you. It is distinct from us, but we have knowledge that you guys don't. And so then it showed it to me. So that definitely goes as evidence to that point, that each particular species of plant, mushroom, has its own kind of evolutionary heroic journey. And maybe they will be more than happy to show it to you if you ask to see.
Yeah. Yeah. Be careful what you ask for, I guess. Because sometimes you might not be able to handle it, and you can't take it back. So you talk about the Ouroboros and the infinity sign, which is certainly appropriate. Like I said as well, one of my first realizations, like hit me like a ton of bricks, was the realization that we are eternal beings. Like this is not just like one go around the sun and we're done. Like this feels like cyclical in nature, like kind of like nature itself, the four seasons. This was a realization that came to me early on with psychedelics. And I came from a religious childhood upbringing where I was raised in the church, a Christian family, very big on like the Bible and like written revelation. Like if it's not in the Bible, it's not true, or you can't trust it. I've always been of the opinion, like kind of like a Henry David Thoreau, like transcendentalist idea, not to just credit any of that, like the oracles or scripture, or any of that, but just I believe that everything you need to know about the nature of reality, you can garner from just looking at the observable natural world. So just as a tree, is birthed in the spring, has its summer, its autumn season, which would be old age for us, it dies, and then it's reborn again in the spring. Like nature tells us that things go in cycles. Nothing is just over. But yet, again, bringing it back to our materialist world, we're led to believe that we just die and that's the end of the story. And I've never believed that. Whether you're religious or an agnostic or whatever, like I just could never accept the idea that death is the end. And now I'm certain of it. Like I have no doubts in my mind that we go on after our physical shell dies. But what I'm getting at is this idea of, I guess you just use the word reincarnation. And I know that word carries a lot of baggage for a lot of people. There's a great documentary I just watched on Netflix called Surviving Death. It's a mini series, but there's one episode on reincarnation. It kind of put to bed all doubts for me. Like I'm certain of it. I would bet my life that reincarnation is real now. I don't know if it's for everybody. And for those who would argue, and maybe like from a religious perspective, I mean, even like Jesus in the New Testament argues for reincarnation for John the Baptist. He says, if you'll have it so, like he is Elijah come again, which is to say like he's a reincarnated version of somebody who lived before. So like, I know I was always taught as a kid, like reincarnation is like this new age kind of spiritualist thing that is, kind of bonk. Eastern schools obviously revere it in a different kind of way because it's a big part of like the idea of karma. I don't know if I go that far either, to the point where it's like a religious like principle for me, but I know it. I'm certain of it. The plant medicines have shown me that it exists. And I've also, seen empirically through other people who have recounted past lives and pointed out things they couldn't have possibly known. So all that to say, have you ever gotten like a revelation from any of the plant medicines in nature about, the eternality of your own being, or any sort of enlightenment about your own cycles of existence, whether or not you've been here before or what's in store for you in the future? Have you gotten any sort of insight into the cyclical nature of the human experience or the soul?
I have, yeah, in short, and it wasn't through a psychedelic experience, oddly enough, but it was well into my journey. It was through meditation. It's a little bit different than the reincarnation thing, and we could definitely come right back to that, but this is an example that comes right to the top of my mind, which is a somewhat interesting one. It was to me, at least when it came to me. So in short, I graduated high school. I used to live up in Chicago, right? And I had no idea what to do with my life. I think many of us are in these shoes too. You're just trying to figure something out. So eventually I just went to junior college because, well, I don't know, I guess knock out some gen eds, and that's what I was advised to do. So why not? You can't stand that process. It's just like high school all over again. So I was very unfulfilled, and I lacked direction. I lacked meaning. My life was not all that it could be, and I was too young to even know that. I was just stuck, and I felt the consequences of that. So I sunk into a spontaneous, what would have been meditation, although I wouldn't even have been able to describe it at that point in my life. I mean, I was 18, basically. And what came to me was a call to adventure. And I would begin to frame that way later in my life, but it was essentially investigate being a pilot, which became my life path. So I got out of this meditation. I Googled the thing. I applied to a school within my state. And it kind of then just seemed like that path was orchestrated by that higher self I was referring to earlier. Things just worked out. There were definitely a road of trials that I was presented with, but in the initial stages, everything went my way. And I accepted. I knew what the path was then going to be for the next couple of years. I pursued it, and it worked out. Okay, so tying it into kind of reaching into those other realms, about a year ago, I'm now living in Austin, Texas. I was sitting here in a random meditation, deliberately doing a meditation. And my process of meditation is simply to empty the mind. I know there are many different ways out there, but just to give you context of what I was doing, that's it, empty. So I'm sitting there, blank slate mind, as much as I can. And I realized that I needed to send that message to myself, which was 10 years younger, that 18-year-old version of me or whatever. And in this meditation, that just seemed to be what I was doing, almost spontaneously. Like the idea kind of came, and then it was like I sent that back. So, I mean, I know that sounds a little weird, and it's not quite exactly to the idea of reincarnation, but just within my own life, that was an example of sort of working through time with a version of the self. And as I was talking about before, I think when you're continuing along your life cycle, you get those little messages for yourself. It might not be in a meditation or whatever, but it might just be through a life experience. And that might be sent back sort of like in time from that eternal self. Specifically when it comes to dealing with the reincarnation cycle, I've got one other little bit on that. I was once in contact with a woman and we tripped together and we went camping together. And it wasn't quite, again, a reincarnation thing, but a very odd thing started to happen. She began to talk as if she was a representation of that feminine archetypal goddess energy that we were kind of referring to earlier. And I mean, it came out of nowhere. We were actually having sex at the time. And she sort of seemed to be like a reincarnation of the mushroom goddess that I had previously had an image of within my closed eye visuals from a heroic dose trip years ago. And it was like I was seeing that behind my closed eyes, and then I would open my eyes and I would see this otherworldly purple mushroom language of creation makeup upon the woman who was in front of me. I closed my eyes and there was the memory for me, and I opened and there she was. So it was all coming to light. There was no difference between inner and outer worlds, and that was an experience of it. So it was so amazing for both of us, and she was kind of in the same space, that we stopped what we were doing and we began to talk about it. I was kind of like, are you having this happen for you too? And she's like, yeah. So then she starts to speak in this sort of formal goddess tone. It was as if I was communing with the mushroom goddess. She was telling me things about my life and life path that we had never talked about before, and kind of like giving me a confidence boost, pat on the back and all of this. And it was so strange that we couldn't do anything but continue to engage in it. We were open to it and we played it out. And what she ended up saying, going back to the reincarnation point, she said something like, you called to me years ago in the previous trip, and I incarnated here, and we were sort of destined to have this meeting of souls in some way. So make of that what you will, but we were both convinced that that was a reality happening outside of time, and then those life paths were colliding in that event.
Wow, that's pretty wild. Yeah, I could go up, down tangents and rabbit holes with you for hours, because I recognize in a lot of your content and a lot of your stories, similar things that I've experienced. And I've just scratched the surface, and maybe a dozen experiences. I'm hoping there's a lot more story to tell and a lot more to discover for myself. But it seems like you've validated a lot of, questions I've had myself. I'd like to get into the specifics in the time we have left about some of, the tales and the journeys you've taken. I know you write about them in your book. I've read through a couple. You have some comedic relief in your stories, which keep them entertaining. And you also have some really, interesting insights about, the deep rooted nature of, the message of some of these plant medicines. So I'll let you pick, whatever ones you think are most profound that you'd like to share with the audience. But if you could share one or two, not to give, your books away, but, one or two that you think would resonate, maybe, with somebody who's, exploring or just curious to learn more about the subject, that you could kind of just shed light on.
Yeah, thank you, man. First of all, I appreciate that a lot. The aim with these things was essentially to be like campfire stories. So if we were sitting around a campfire, I think we would do basically what we're doing right now. We would just exchange stories like this. And I tried to put that sentiment and that vibe into the short trip report so that they have an entertainment value, obviously. But at the same time, hopefully there's something like, that's a head scratcher. Or maybe that's something to investigate myself, or this, that, and the other. So kind of call to adventure for your fellow man. But yeah, before we were talking about one of the early ones in the first book, which was the Spaceship Strip Club. And that's probably a good one to showcase some of the angle that I come from pretty often in all of these, which is the angle of the individual. And I simply mean that I don't seek in any way to try to make these things more ceremonial, these experiences, than they have to be. Mm-hmm. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to throw tradition and ceremony under the bus either. I'm not. I've plugged into them, obviously, as we've talked about through ayahuasca and such. But I think that there's a real divide in the psychedelic space between those who use it in that way, in a traditional use, and then those who use it recreationally, as we were alluding to earlier in the cast. And much of my journey seems to have been to just use it, just period, plain and simple, and to get what you can out of it in a growth-centric way. But that doesn't always have to be in the jungle or whatever. So anyway, back to this trip report. This one was pretty early in my journey. And it kind of speaks to the feminine goddess energy, too, of the mushroom. That was a real present energy for me early with my use of the mushroom, it seemed like almost every time I was in that sexual, sensual space with the mushroom, which in some situations just gives rise to what seems to be an interdimensional act of sex with this like non-incorporated energy of the mushroom goddess or something like that, but by yourself without another person even. But as it was unfolding in the world in this particular story, I went out to a strip club, which was pretty close to my house. It was a real chill place, very small, kind of in the middle of nowhere on the outskirts of the city and such. But it had just a very chill vibe. I put it that way. So it was kind of like the right stage for this. And I remember getting there and just experiencing that this place seemed to be that space flavor I was talking about earlier with the mushroom that it seems to give you behind closed eyes. It was like that taking form where I was. I mean, just the metallic glint of the colors and of course the lights being very psychedelically colored in that particular place and all of that. And then that goddess energy, it's just there. And these lovely ladies were there dancing, swinging away on the pole. And there we were just observing with awe in some sense. And I mean, everyone, all the men there were doing that, right? That's kind of what you do at a place like that. But I was really able to absorb that. And it seemed very pristine, very pure. And even when you connected with a lady, it seemed like, and had a dance or just talk to her or something, it seemed like there was an element of what I was talking about with that camping trip with that previous lady. It was almost like you're communing with a part of that goddess energy. And of course, the particular lady wasn't aware of it, but you were like getting the sensation that it was speaking through her, that feminine archetypal energy was kind of speaking through her in just very basic sort of ways. But that was unfolding itself there. And I remember thinking at the time, I wonder how many other people are experiencing exactly this thing going on right now for them. I don't know, maybe there were other people there doing the same thing, but probably not, because it was a pretty small place. And it was more or less pretty uneventful after that. But the take home from an experience like that is just that anywhere you are, realistically, assuming that you're not terribly uncomfortable, you're probably going to have the opportunity to absorb some of those primal energies you were referring to earlier, some of those sort of eternally charged vibes that just speak through us as actors in the world. And when you're even interacting with other people, you have the chance to see that when you've clarified your lenses of perception with the psychedelic aid. And that happens anywhere. It doesn't have to be behind closed eyes in telepathic communication with the entity or the self. It doesn't. It could be through a person. And if you feel that kind of call to adventure, it's a way to explore the medicines which do make the line between inner and outer self seem to dissolve, especially when the dose is higher. But the takeaway there is still you can gain something from using these things in a wide variety of contexts.
Yeah. And I mentioned this at the beginning as well. You were the only other person I've ever talked to about psychedelics. So I've had heard say, there was like a sensual or a sexuality type of component to the psilocybin experience. I've said that to a few people because I had the same thing, and they looked at me like confused, like, "What? Do you mean MDMA?" But no, it was psilocybin. And I never knew what to make of that. It happened to me a couple of times, not every trip. And I certainly, I wasn't in an environment that was really conducive to that. A couple of times I was just on my living room floor. But it was like this energy, like pulsating through my whole body. It felt like a whole body orgasmic experience. So yeah, so you know what I mean? That's the closest thing I could compare it to, but it was like just pure energy just flowing through my body. And I never felt more alive. I could just feel the energy flowing from my body. And I was like, what is this? I got it a little bit on the ayahuasca, but I got it big time on the mushrooms, and it kind of threw me for a loop. So reading that story resonated with me. I had a experience at a Halloween party a couple of years ago with a small dose of LSD that was sort of like that, but the mushrooms was on another level. The mushrooms was just like pure energy and sensuality, just radiating. I felt like I was tapping into like some just creative, like sexual drive that like came out of nowhere. So it was cool to hear you kind of confirm that you had a similar experience in that regard.
Well, right, man. And that's not surprising. Just on that note, really, if you think about it, just the sexual act that brings pleasure in the way that it does is creational in purpose. Of course, that's what it is. Of course, it doesn't have to be used that way, but surely that's the purpose of it with our evolutionary development. So to find yourself in these spaces, which are very removed from your normal character and very energetic, highly charged, does not surprise me, because it has everything to do with the creational act of being itself in some sense, but also the destruction too. And that's where you kind of loop into that infinity, right? That source feeding into itself. You can touch upon that. And I've heard similar things reported by other people too. It's like a whole body orgasm. It has seemed to me before, when I've been in those experiences, which I certainly have been many times, that you are touching upon perhaps like the entire iceberg that sex really is. Like previously having only physical sober sex or drunk sex or whatever, it's almost like you're just touching on the top portion of the iceberg that's above the water, and then you can know the whole thing by being in some of these energetic states, which are just seemingly dropping what was obscuring it. That's the sensation too. It's like whatever structures or ego you had in place that just divorced yourself from allowing that energy to flow through you is simply dissolved with the psychedelic experience. And then you are, as you say, essentially a channel for it. And anyway, it just, again, doesn't surprise me to see that that is extremely pleasurable. It has to have, in some sense, that feel to it, because it is creation itself. So that just seems to all tie together nicely within the psychedelic experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you kind of, at the core, when you really dig down to the root of what you think that the message is, or the eternal truth maybe that you get from the plant medicine, it sounds to me like, love is kind of that resonating theme. And I hear that, a lot from people in this space. I agree with it. I don't know how to quantify it or how to describe it adequately, or to even put more substance around it. Like love, such a vague term, especially in today's world where we dumb down and overuse every term that has any sort of like weightiness to it. But when you say love, like, I know what you're saying, because I've been there as well. And there's like this eternal kind of universal acceptance feeling to it. But what do you think the purpose is in that, and communicating it to the travelers who experience it?
So many of these higher order principles that I referred to as talking before, of truth, compassion, right, love, I have personally just developed flip-flop words for that are hopefully more clear and usable. And when it comes to love, I have a concise phrase: evolutionary growth. And I'll unpick that a little bit, but I think it is something like what propels us forth in the world, which is a mechanism that has to do with our development or something like that. I think it comes from the evolutionary process, the life cycle, and it beckons us forth. It has to do with the call to adventure and the heroic journey. It is the thing that we engage in order to transform, to grow. And so I think this process of complexifying and of growing out through curiosity is sort of what life biologically seems to do. It explores and it grows, and you might think of that as being governed by a sort of impulse that we can't very clearly define. But if we're to put, as you said, a very vague term on it, which it is, we might as well in some sense say God, or some of these other words that are just very ambiguous. But what does that actually function as in the world, in our life? Well, of course, we have relational love, we have love of self, we have all these other things. But I think in a slightly more zoomed out way, and yet not so zoomed out that we're just talking about absolute all transcendent, I use it as a sort of growth, a catalyst to growth, which I again think kind of aims you at your highest and best personal use in the world, if used appropriately, to carry you through your trials and tribulations and keep the resolve and the courage that you need to proceed through the life cycle. Because it's not all love, rainbows, and bliss, obviously. That's just a take-home point that's very true. You only are informed by the unknown when you get knocked around through pain, through suffering, which is, I think, why those elements are fundamental to many world-renowned religions, suffering as such. And what love is sort of like the counteracting or the propulsive force that really allows you to continue striving forth for reasons that I don't pretend to fully understand. And I'm not so sure that we as a species fully understand, but I don't think we necessarily have to recognize that there is a force that provides that function, and then be able to actually use it consciously in our life to keep us going through the cycle.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And, you hear a lot of these stories, of folks who, I don't know, maybe even in like a near death experience, like this white light, like just beckoning them and like love and acceptance and things like that. And I wonder sometimes if what you're experiencing in that moment with, like, a flood of adrenaline and, just overload of, endorphins, and is that the same as a psychedelic experience? Are you tapping into that same type of energy? Is it something, deeply rooted within ourselves, that we're tapping into with it, whether it be DMT, psilocybin, etc., or is there something outside of us in the universe? Like, and I guess what I'm getting back to is this core question of, do you feel it can be both, but do you feel that the essence of your journeys, or the travel logs that you've documented, have resonated or originated within yourself, or are you tapping into an external reality outside of yourself and engaging with a consciousness outside of your own consciousness?
I've thought about it both ways, realistically, and I don't have any super well-defined answers other than the overly ambiguous one I gave you earlier, which I do think has an underlying truth to it. It is that you are diving into yourself. I mean, just think about it at the very basic level. We're taking these things, and at least the way the modern world is structured, supposedly we are only going into our own minds and experiences. However, as I've kind of outlined with some of those stories, and hopefully this made that point, with continued use, and especially sometimes in social settings or intimate settings, like with that one lady, and there have been any number of those that I've experienced in life, you really start to see that intelligent process, that order that you see behind closed eyes in the psychedelic space, which is only supposedly occurring within your mind, that doesn't just exist within your own mind, that is part of the process that constitutes the natural world too. And on that last vision quest, I was running into that hard and heavy there for sure. Just throughout the quest, I was seeing that whatever process I thought that I was engaged in to allow me to navigate through my quest, which had its own spontaneous trials that became ever present throughout the thing, that I was constantly given the resources I needed to prevail through that. And they seemed to come just from the environment in some ways. So you see, it's like even when I was sober, that line between inner and outer, within, without, it really starts to dissolve. But just to kind of muse on some of the ideas, it might very well be that we are just antennas and we are receiving, we're tapping into some signal for sure with these things. I could totally see that. It also might be something like what I was saying is the case when we go into ourselves deep enough and with enough experience. It's sort of like the torus. We're going in, if you think about it, going inward, and then it kind of circulates out to represent the world. And this goes to an idea Carl Jung put forth too, like you're going to begin to see the archetypes in the world if you don't address them within the self or something like that. And that certainly could be thought of as shadow work too. If you're not going to address darkness or unconsciousness within yourself, those elements will present themselves to you in the world. And if you're not aware of, let's say, darkness in man, because you don't confront it in yourself, it will be presented to you in the world, and it's going to hurt you.
Yeah.
I had a whole cycle of that too. So yeah, anyway, I'm sorry. I didn't want to get too vague on that question, but I really do think that is the answer. I think you start going in and you start seeing the within and the without are essentially representations of the same thing. And it might also be too that the world gives you the opportunity to become more aware of yourself too through the road of trials that it seems to present.
Do you believe that there's ultimately an attainment of, like, I guess you'd call it like a cosmic oneness, that we all derive of one consciousness or one essence or energy? Or do you believe in the eternal individuality of our own unique consciousness?
Eternal oneness. I think
Oneness.
that is the self. I think it's the seer beyond and above all seers, just pure source-like consciousness that you were referring to earlier. I always liken that to being the disco ball. And the pure white light at the center is like that unbound consciousness. And then maybe the multicolor frame lights around it are unique angles that the light is shining through, and we are experiencing consciousness through those angles. And all the while, the, I guess, point of the whole show is to forget and go out and have an experience and then come back into remembrance of self, which is to start at source, to get caught up in the illusion, and then to ultimately begin to question it such that you end up back in that source space or something like that. But then that's no fun. So you got to go back into it and choose to forget willfully or something like that. And I think a real takeaway in that process too that's worth mentioning is if you start to see that and begin to try to integrate it, you're not so focused on pure unity consciousness or just transcending the world at all times. You begin to see the one that you refer to, that clear white consciousness, light, in the many. You begin to see that dissolution between external and internal worlds, and now you can appreciate the Godhead in your fellow man, and even begin to start to have some sober experiences of what I was talking about, where it seems like that oneness, that unity consciousness is communicating to you through other people you meet in the world, or presenting you again with opportunities to know more about it. And that becomes ever available when I think you proceed through enough of it to not get hung up on any one of them. So you're no longer rooting in duality unconsciously in the illusion, but nor are you focused on unity, which is, I suppose, just the opposite of that. But you're kind of trying to rock that world of non-duality that the Buddhists would speak of, which is to recognize nirvana within the cycle of time, samsara.
Yeah. This has been really, really insightful. I talk for hours about this, man. It's been a great conversation. Before I let you go, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, where can folks get your books and learn more about what you're working on?
Yeah, thanks, man. TravelingNobody.net is the website, and that has links to Amazon with all of the books in the Visionary Quest series. It'll take you to Amazon, or like I said, and it has it in Audible and paper and Kindle as well. And there's also a podcast I recently started there, Traveling and Nobodies, to do the same thing, sit down and compare notes.
Cool. I will link to all that in the show notes when it's published. And yeah, if anybody has questions, you guys know how to email me and get a hold of me. I can forward along your info as well if you have any questions. So yeah, this has been really insightful, really interesting. Are you still writing, feverishly right now? Have you gotten most of it out, or?
Yeah, there are 4 books in this new Visionary Quest series that basically just been launched, and I'm always sort of using these trips, like I said, as life pivot points. So right now I'm about halfway through the 5th book, which will eventually come out, and the aim is to have 8 of them to hit that infinity symbol, and it just seems appropriate. So we'll
Yeah,
see how that looks like. Yeah.
cool. Well, when you get there, man, let me know, and let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot. Let's do it again sometime. Take care.
Okay, yeah, peace.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.